Good morning, everybody. I am Dongwook Kim. I'm professor of Graduate School of Public Administration, Seoul National University. Also, I'm a director of Center of Intelligence, Society, and Policy. I am very pleased to announce the starting the 2024 CISP Global Symposium. Our center held special forum last week at this conference room. That time, Professor Fabrizio Girardi of University of Zurich presented his wonderful paper on citizens' perception towards AI and digital democracy. So today, our center organized wonderful global symposium, today and tomorrow. This symposium is composed of 4 sessions. We have 3 sessions today, okay? Let me introduce a wonderful presenter and discussant for the first session. Today's first presenter is Daniel Schiff, General Schiff from Purdue University, United States. Okay, give a big hands to him. And the next, designated discussants, Professor Wookjoon from Seoul National University of Science and Technology. Second designated discussant is Patrick Stewart, Professor Patrick Stewart from University of Arkansas. He will connect it later on online, okay? So we have 2 hours for this session. Maybe you have 30 minutes around. Okay.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Dongwook, Chihei, for organizing this tremendous event. So I'm really thrilled to be here. First time at Seoul National University, first time in Korea, but excited about the potential for discussion and collaboration across the US, European Union, South Korean context on AI. So I am Daniel Schiff. I'm an assistant professor focused on technology policy in the United States at Purdue University, which is, for those of you who don't know, in Indiana, about 2 hours south of Chicago. So Eastern time zone, but in Midwestern United States. And at Purdue, I'm also the co-director of the Governance and Responsible AI Lab called GRAIL. And I've been working in AI policy and ethics for about 15 years, starting with my undergraduate thesis, which was called The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence. So I've been in this field for a while, and it's been a pleasure to see the community grow up, a lot of talented emerging scholars here, and many important research questions. So for today's talk, I'll be going into the formative years of the US AI policy here. Alrighty. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background and motivation why this is an important issue. I'm a policy scientist primarily by background, before then philosophy. I spent about 5 years in the nonprofit sector. I know some of you are working in public management. Worked in industry as responsible AI lead at JPMorgan Chase immediately before coming to Purdue. So I worked in industry governance, standards, the translation of ethics into practice. And this talk today is very much about the translation of ethics into policy. So that's what I'll be getting into, is really the intersection of ethics and policy. So after motivating this, I'm going to get into the case study itself, methodology, our key findings here focused on the US federal level AI policy agenda. And this study was published last year. It goes up from 2016 through 2020, so it's a 5-year time period. But I do want to bring us up to the present also, because there have been many developments in the last couple of years, as we all know, including the recent Korean AI Safety Summit, which was here just a week or 2 ago. So we'll try to reflect on the present and some research directions. But I will say, as we get into the discussant comments and the opportunity for open-ended discussion, Please don't feel limited to policy studies or the US agenda or those topics, especially for the students, whether you're interested in things like generative AI or AI in education, deepfakes, corporate AI governance, AI ethics. Happy to talk about any of those topics as relates to your interests at work. So please feel free to treat it as an open conversation there. Okay. And I do hope that, whether during my talk or throughout the conference, we have a chance to talk about some of the parallels, what we can learn from each other, some differences between our contexts. So this is getting into our conversation here. In fall of this past year, 2023, the Biden administration put out an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. It's one of the more major policy developments to come out of the US. And this logo on the top left here, I like quite a lot. It's from the National AI Initiative Office, long acronym, but it has the American eagle, our national bird, over a representation of a neural network. And then the 7 stars at the bottom are meant to represent the 7 decades since the origin of AI as a concept in the 1950s. That's kind of a cool logo. So in this executive order and other policy documents that have come out in recent years, we see language kind of like this. So artificial intelligence presents a new frontier for enhancing our economic and national security, as well as our way of life. We see other types of language and discourse here also. Responsible AI development is instrumental to our, meaning the US, strategic competition with China. So we see this conversation. And then we see that responsible AI development is key, that we must remain steadfast in mitigating risks associated with AI while ensuring that all Americans can benefit. So yet another type of discourse or narrative here about risks and benefits and responsible AI. So this is in essence a bit of agenda setting that's going on. A couple other developments in the last few years. We had some major legislation coming before our 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the US Senate. So the America Competes Act, the Innovation and Competition Act, what eventually passed as the Chips and Science Act here. We have many other laws that are under consideration at the federal level. So the Algorithmic Accountability Act, 5 or 6 laws about deepfakes and misinformation, protecting elections, as well as laws about labor, the No Robot Bosses Act. And lots of action by various sectoral regulators and agencies, not just our Congress. So the Federal Trade Commission that is concerned with things like misconduct and deception, fraud. The Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is doing quite a lot. And I'd say 3 of the more major things here. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy put out an AI Bill of Rights, again, very ethics forward, one of the more progressive and cutting edge documents on AI ethics. NIST, the standards body that makes US standards, put out an AI risk management framework, also in January of last year, and there's been a lot of work as part of that. And recently, coming out of the executive order, NIST has launched an AI Safety Institute. This is sort of parallel with the UK and Korea's AI Safety Institutes. And our lab, Grail, is actually a member of the Safety Institute consortium here. So lots of action by regulators, different legislation in play. So what we're seeing here is that a policy window, to use the language that policy scientists use, a policy window is open. There's a chance for change, a chance for key decision making here. And this policy is under development. For a very, very quick background for those of you who are not focused on AI in your work, just taking us to the 21st century here, we had major advances in AI in the 2010s, in computer vision, in natural language understanding and generation, leading to all of the big tech companies to really go from mobile first or cloud first orientations to AI first. This is their big effort here. Calls about ethical and social risks, calls for governance, and sort of this raises the big question of how are we going to govern strategic technologies, emerging technologies, general purpose technologies, I mean here, not generative pre-trained transformers. How will AI be governed in the 21st century? And I think there are several key questions here. The degree of centralization or decentralization. Minhan and Chihei and I were talking about this yesterday. Timing, self-regulation. How much do we support self-regulation versus external regulation? Do we coordinate or compete across international, national lines? How much do we express precaution? How much do we want to open source technologies, or is that too risky? So these are all big dimensions of AI policy we need to think through. So broadly speaking, are we going to approach AI similar to how we've thought about technology governance in recent decades, or are we going to take on some new approaches? Related to this, what actually is the substance of the federal policy agenda in the US, and who's actually shaping this? So we might think about this economic focus, or an ethical focus, or a geopolitical focus, as I showed you in those examples a few slides ago. We might wonder whether academic experts or industry are shaping the conversation. Do members of the public have a voice, have a say here? These are all important questions that relate to us regardless of context, but these are some of the motivations for me to pursue this particular study. Okay, so thinking about an AI as an object of policy study, what does it mean to study AI itself? Right, this is a relatively new field, AI policy. Of course, AI is not new. And I think there's a few characteristics we can use to make sense of it. So AI is certainly an emerging technology, and there's a great literature on this. It's a general purpose technology, meaning it can be used in lots of different domains, and it's what's called a strategic technology, meaning it has economic value, it has military value. And from this, I think we can infer, and we've certainly heard about, AI having pervasive impact, prominent impact. This impact cuts across every sector: healthcare, education, criminal justice, labor, you name it, as well as dual use or mixed use implications. So in any sector we pick, AI can do positive things, or it could potentially lead to harms. And this is not necessarily the same for every policy issue. So we can think about the economic and military value, we can think about ethical and social risks, all of these are in play. The second set of aspects that I think really prominently surrounds AI is this idea of uncertainty or ambiguity. So why? So we know there are risks and benefits, costs and benefits, but we don't know exactly when or where, we don't know how much there will be, we don't know who's gonna lose their jobs or not, who's gonna gain more wages. These are up in the air. Relating to that, that means that how AI affects people in different spaces is going to have variable salience, meaning it may be more or less important to you. If you're a citizen, maybe you care about losing your job, but you don't care about AI in the financial system. Maybe you're worried about misinformation and deepfakes, but you're not worried about content moderation on social media. So who participates? Participation is also quite fluid. And because AI is so broad and has so many different dimensions, I think that leaves lots of room for contestation over the frame. Is AI good? Is it bad? Is it about risks? Is it about winning? So all of these things shape the story of AI and lead to what I would call a kind of high stakes policy ambiguity, where fights over setting the nature of the agenda become especially important. In the context of this study, this raises two core questions for me. What really are the issues that are framing or dominating the emerging AI agenda, and who's influencing the agenda? Who's influencing policymakers here? Who has power in the policy process? Okay, so let's get a little bit more into the core theory here. And there's really two core conceptual pillars of this study here. One is this idea of competing notions of technology policy. And I have a very simplified heuristic here, but one way we can think about this is the sort of traditional approach to innovation policy that's been around for several decades. Here we'd be thinking about a focus on strategic goals, economic advancement, geopolitical security, very sort of pro-innovation, very much dominated by experts and industry voices. So to give an example from our Office of Management and Budget, this is sort of the regulatory agency that oversees the other regulatory agencies. They wrote, agencies must avoid a precautionary approach, including regulatory or non-regulatory actions that needlessly hamper AI innovation and growth. So a very strong pro-innovation stance. On the other hand, we have what I'm calling a transformative approach. Now, there are different terms you might have heard, like responsible research and innovation, RRI, mission-oriented innovation policy. So there are different versions of this, but roughly what we're thinking about here is a heightened focus on ethical and social impacts and goals. Indeed, a lot of this is a response to perceived failures of the old innovation paradigm. So we haven't been able to address climate change or global inequality sufficiently, would be the argument. So we need to think that innovation also has risks and harms, and think about new goals for innovation. Another core feature here being involvement of broader constituencies. So can the public, can civil society, can they have a say in shaping the AI agenda versus just sort of industry or experts? So another quote here that more reflects this. The United States must foster public trust and confidence in AI technologies, protect civil liberties, privacy, and American values. So a little bit more of this transformative narrative. Okay, so core research question for the study: does the US federal AI policy agenda better reflect this traditional approach or the more transformative approach to innovation policy? And this is a very simple heuristic for a more complicated story, but I think it's a useful conceptual device. More complicated question beyond this very simple descriptive one is the explanatory corollary. Why has AI policy taken this trajectory? What is it about the policy process, about AI as a technology, about the context that's leading to this result? So I'll try to provide some insight here, but I think this is really an open-ended conversation and would welcome your thoughts. Okay. Second conceptual pillar here for the policy scholars here, getting into some policy process theory. In particular, a very prominent framework called the multiple streams framework. This is often used to understand agenda setting processes. So the way this framework works is there are three separate streams of activity. So first we have the problem stream and the solution stream, or policy stream it's called. So in the problem stream, you have societal problems that come to people's attention or that become constructed as problems. You might have an indicator, like a statistical measure of poverty or health decline or aging, whatever it is, or you might have a focusing event. An airplane crashed, and that tells you there's some problem in aviation safety. And the solution stream side, you're thinking about putting forward a policy alternative to get adopted, and you wonder, is this policy, is it feasible? Is it going to work? Is it economically viable? Is it something that the different political parties will accept? Is it value acceptable? So these are some considerations. And then you have the politics stream. This is essentially the political institutional context. So who's in power? Who's in the presidency? Who's in parliament? Are they unified or divided parties? What are the positions of civil society and industry lobbyists? What is the national mood? What is the public worried about these days? So these three are in play. And then what happens is a window opens in either the political stream or the problem stream. Typically, this would be something like a new election. New president has an agenda they want to get through. They got in on a mandate. Or a problem stream. There's been a big disaster or change. So ChatGPT is released publicly. People are worried about copyright and data protection. What do we do about it? This is a problem or a focusing event. Then within this window, actors come along that we call policy entrepreneurs, as they're sort of shaping the policy environment. And their job is to take ideas from the problem and solution stream and merge them together. So they couple them together. They do this by using their resources and access, building coalitions, finding the policy venues that will be receptive to their messages, and trying to define problems or issues in a favorable way. This is why issue framing is quite important. It's something I focus on here. So they engage in this process of coupling, and this leads to agenda formation, eventually policy adoption implementation. So these are some of the aspects I'm studying here, really focusing on the bolded elements for this study, because there are many, many different dimensions of this framework. So we'll look at the agenda here, look at some of these different elements as they manifest in US federal AI policy, and ask, is this reflective of the traditional or the transformative paradigm, or aspects of both, or neither? Okay. So those are our two conceptual frameworks. Okay, getting into the methodology. So the data source for this study is the AI.gov repository of strategic AI documents. So they started keeping this repository that they would call key or strategic AI documents. I collected all of them from 2016 through 2020. 2016 is about the very beginning of AI policy as a field. So 2 or 3 reports came out under the Obama administration about labor, automation, things like that. And these documents include scientific and technical reports in red, strategy documents in orange, requests for information or comments, budgetary documents, ethics principles, international declarations, many different types of documents, but often reports. And these are coming from our executive agencies, so our bureaucracy, not from our Congress, for example, which has implications for limitations. So curated by this AI Initiative Office. And I think that this data source is valuable as a reflection of the policy ideas that are coming out of our decision makers here. So some of these decisions are formal, many of them are just advisory or commentaries, thinking about opportunities, risks, and benefits. But nevertheless, I think it reflects the debates that have happened in the committees and task forces and agencies that have thought about these issues and said, what matters? These are the real things we need to think about. So I think it's a reflection of which ideas have risen to the surface and are shaping the agenda. This does mean that the document set won't speak very well to hearings that are happening in Congress or to the position of the US president and things like that, but it is reflective of the executive agencies. And to give you a feel for what this looks like, a few documents, for example, we have the Principles of AI Ethics for the Intelligence Community, so the CIA, FBI. We have at the bottom left, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Plan for Federal Engagement in Developing Technical Standards and Related Tools, US Leadership in AI. We have the Government Accountability Office in the top middle, Emerging Opportunities, Challenges, and Implications, so benefits, risks, implications, Homeland Security Artificial Intelligence Strategy, Department of Health and Human Services AI Strategy, and AI and Global Health from USAID, our development agency, defining a collective path forward. So these are some of the kinds of documents that I analyzed, probably a couple thousand pages of these documents. So this study is largely a single case study, a holistic case study, primarily qualitative with some simple quantitative descriptive statistics, so nothing super sophisticated here, hopefully something that's accessible to all of us. And what I did was I coded all 4,100 paragraphs in these documents, and I did some adjustments statistically so that really long documents didn't have more importance than smaller documents, for example, because you might have one document that mentions a single issue many times. We don't want that to outweigh all the other documents. So some adjustments. And then essentially what I'm doing is I'm engaged in theoretical pattern matching, looking at this multiple streams framework and these two competing policy paradigms. I'm looking whether we're seeing either of these patterns or not so much. And I did this by creating an a priori codebook here. And this gives you a sample of some of the domains and codes. So for example, you'll see pertinent to the multiple streams framework, focusing events, indicators, issue frames, what are the policy problems and solutions? Focusing events, is it geopolitics and military, or is it about ethical scandals and disasters? For indicators, was it about technical performance and advances in AI, or is it about poverty and fairness? For policy solutions, were they around workforce and education, or were they around public engagement and discourse? And in stakeholders, very simplistically, experts on the one hand, or more broader public participation on the other hand. This is kind of the simplified approach to analyzing these documents and looking for these two approaches. So what did we find? So these graphs here show the prevalence of traditional in red or transformative in blue paradigms in the documents. Anything that was on that left column before would be in red, and the transformative would be in blue. So this is focusing events on the left and indicators on the right. So really core things in setting the agenda here. Now, if you follow the news here, you've seen there are many different ethical scandals that have come up on bias in facial recognition, in the resignation of governments, in welfare scandals and educational scandals, and in fact, many experts that have put out statements warning about AI risks and harms, the global pause letter put out by the Future of Life Institute. Despite all of this, the overwhelming majority of mentions of any indicators or focusing events are traditional, very traditional. So these would be things like Russia or China has advanced in AI policy, the US needs to do this also. These would be things like AI now has this amount of processing power, this is the size of the models, that means that we need to think about it more carefully. We need to build a workforce, we need more computer scientists, very traditional supply side approaches to innovation policy. So 96% of the focusing events coded here and 84% of the indicators were very traditional in nature. And this took me a little bit by surprise, the skew here. Okay, so I want to talk about the issue frames next, briefly. So to give you an example of the innovation frame, this is Congressman Bill Foster, and he wrote in 2019, AI is at the forefront of innovation, changing the way Americans operate in the marketplace. I'm excited to chair the Financial Services Committee Democrats AI Task Force and better understand how developments in AI will affect businesses and consumers. So very much business impact, innovation impact. That's our innovation frame. For the ethics frame, another representative, Yvette Clark, wrote, algorithms determine whether we're hired, sent to jail, or approved for a mortgage, but can result in discrimination. Proud to introduce the bicameral, meaning both houses of our Congress, Algorithmic Accountability Act with Ron Whited and Cory Booker to regulate algorithms and biased tech tools. So that's the ethics frame. And then for the competition frame, Senator Marco Rubio wrote, while we spend our time fighting each other, a China-centric technology future is taking shape. If we don't wake up and get moving, meaning the US, China will be setting global standards for AI, gene editing ethics, 5G, controlling global data flows, and so on. So these are the three issue frames that I examined for across these documents. What did I find here? So at a surface level, the modal document talks about all three issue frames. And this is quite interesting because many of the agencies pertinent to their scope, you would think wouldn't necessarily care about some of these issues, but they do all seem to discuss them. So 57% touch at least one time on all three of these issue frames. Now, this is just a binary measure if we want to get into more depth about whether this is some kind of meaningful synthesis of different frames or whether there's really a dominant frame here. We find that innovation is the dominant frame in about 2/3 of the documents. So innovation will be mentioned much more than an ethics frame or a geopolitical frame. So it's the dominant frame. In fact, what you find is that ethics statements typically live at the mission statement level, meaning the beginning of the document, there's a preamble and they say, AI is going to have a lot of impacts and harms, and it's going to impact society, and we need to think about the ethical issues. But then when you get later into the document, into the detailed plans and timelines, not so much discussion of ethics. That's what I mean by mission statement level. In fact, you could argue here that ethics was made instrumental to other goals. So it's made secondary or for the purposes of achieving innovation here. And I'll give you an example of a sort of a synthesis, which represents AI being subsumed, ethics being subsumed into innovation. So trustworthiness of AI systems is a key factor for the diffusion and adoption of AI, essential to turning AI trustworthiness into a competitive parameter in the global marketplace. So here, this ethical goal of trust is about consumer adoption. It's about diffusing and adopting AI for more economic or innovation-related goals. This is an example of this kind of subsumption of ethics. Okay. Moving on to policy problems. What were the problems as these executive actors saw them? What did they see as the big issues related to AI? Again, red is traditional, blue is transformative, purple is another category which I called hybrid, as it had elements of both, and I'll explain more. So again, we see here, in terms of the proportion of policy problems that are covered across the 63 documents, the top problems are traditional in nature. So 49 of the 63 mention workforce and education. We need more computer scientists, we need fellowship programs, we need more STEM education from kindergarten through tertiary education. 54 of the documents mention security or military, despite many of the agencies here not being involved in security or military. There are many discussions of transformative type problems also. So 25 of the documents mention human rights, 28 mention inequality or inclusion. 2/3, 41 mention fairness or bias in the context of AI. That's also quite remarkable, because this is not necessarily the case in other domains of technology policy, that these issues would have such attention. But with these transformative issues, they're covered less often and they're covered in less depth. So only 16% of the total problems are focused on this. And if you look at something like vulnerable populations on the far right here, that's the least covered category, human and civil rights, inequality and inclusion, they're down at the far right with less coverage. Okay. Then we have this category that I came to call hybrid problems and solutions. And these are the purple again. What I mean by this is, when we would typically think about a topic like privacy or trust, these are often rendered as AI ethics topics, privacy rights, data governance. But when the document started to talk about these, they would sometimes move away from kind of human-centered language. So they would no longer be about protecting humans' rights here and challenges they're facing and what can we do about this. It would move to technical strategies. We're going to introduce differential privacy techniques into our model training. So it's talking about privacy, but in a very different perspective here. Same thing with trust. We saw an example of trust being about a strategy for economic adoption. So consumers need to just trust AI so we can advance it. And there's a question of whether this, again, is something that is a sign of progress or if it's a problem. So on the one hand, we might think that taking an abstract ethical issue that's a social goal and translating it to a specific technical strategy is sort of progress. It means that we have a way to operationalize this. Now we're actually getting something concrete done. But you also might be worried that you're taking these human values and ethical goals and you're sort of taking them out of their human context and turning them into technical strategies or into economic goals. And this is something that I have mixed perceptions of here. Okay, so is this productive that we're seeing this hybridity here, or is it problematic in some ways? Okay, a couple more. So policy solutions, again, what are we actually going to do as we pass legislation regulations? What are our strategies here? And you'll see again that traditional solutions are fairly dominant here. Cooperation across industry and government, research and development. So the US just put out a bipartisan framework for AI, and it includes, I want to say, $30 billion for AI innovation for R&D, but no regulation. And the US AI Safety Institute, I want to say, is funded to around 30 million. So about a 1,000 to 1 ratio in innovation versus safety funding in a very simple sense. Data quality and access. We need more data to train better AI models. Workforce and education. We need more computer scientists. So these are the most dominant solutions across these documents. On the other hand, there are some solutions that could admit to both traditional and more transformative strategies. So there's a good bit of talk about impact assessment or risk assessment, discussion of people need to create standards and follow standards. We need to do monitoring. What's not totally clear is what will be in these standards, what will be in these impact assessments. Will they cover big picture social and ethical harms, or will they be more narrow? But I do think this is sort of an open space for continued contestation and politics. And it will depend on the specific design of these tools and systems. And this is an important leverage point for people trying to work in this space, shape this space. Okay. And then lastly, who are the actors? When the documents mention government or industry or academics, who are they talking about in all these 4,100 paragraphs? And we see is strong expert domination here. So this diagram is showing the intersection of experts or the public against the different policy solutions. When were they mentioned in tandem? This is kind of a crass way of thinking about the intersection, but it gives you a sense and probably overstates the role of the public, if anything. So you see the public most often mentioned with respect to cooperation, dialogue. We should talk to the public. We care about the public's voice. What do they think about this? Maybe they're going to be harmed by AI. But again, when you get down to the section 4 of a document and it says, here's our timeline, here are the task forces, here's the deliverables, here's the person in charge of the task force, that was, I want to say, exclusively industry and government. So in all of these detailed timelines, there is no forum for two-way public engagement, there's no citizen committee, there's no democratic assembly of the public. It's only mentioned as a general aspiration, but it's not actually operationalized. And this was quite stark. In fact, despite a growing body of public opinion research, and I do quite a bit of this, and there's more bodies in the last couple of years doing great public opinion work, there were essentially no mentions of public opinion metrics. Nothing here said 46% of the public is worried about X or 78% of the public supports Y. None of that was mentioned in any of these documents across hundreds of mentions of different indicators, which I see as a very minimalistic engagement with public opinion and public shaping the policy agenda. Okay, so key discussion points, key takeaways here. So one, why might we have seen this sort of result here in certainly the early years? One could be lack of technical feasibility of AI ethics solutions or transformative type solutions. And to grab a representative quote here, here's from our standards body in 2019. While stakeholders expressed broad agreement that societal and ethical considerations must factor into AI standards, it is not clear how that should be done, and whether there is yet sufficient scientific and technical basis to develop those standards provisions. So we want to do ethical and societal issues, but we don't know how to actually do it. So maybe this is just sort of technically we're not sure how to make sense of this. On the other hand, I think there are some policy solutions that don't meet value acceptability. They're not politically feasible, we might say. So if you look at many of the standards and regulations and the auditing practices that are being proposed, many of them will focus on things like privacy. They'll focus on algorithmic bias in models, something where you can create a statistic potentially and you can measure that. But when you get to sort of deeper concerns, societal injustice and the power of workers and global equality, those things are not quite fully acceptable in US policy discourse. So they may be sort of kicked out of the conversation in some ways. A third interpretation here is that some of these transformative solutions don't really fit institutionally into the scope of our agencies. And what do I mean by this? So let's take an agency like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, that regulates transportation. They focus on safety. They want to know, is your car going to crash? Is it built? Is it passing all of its tests? They might focus a little bit on cybersecurity or emissions sometimes, so some environmental issues. But suppose you were to observe, as many of these reports did, maybe 5 million truck drivers will lose their jobs, or maybe they'll end up sitting on the passenger side of their car while an AI is driving the car, and they'll sort of sit there and be unhappy with their job. The NHTSA doesn't have ways of thinking about those issues. It doesn't deal with labor displacement. It doesn't deal with the meaningfulness of work. It deals with safety. So they translate these issues within their understanding. And this may be due to institutional inertia, their understanding or their regulated scope, what they think they're actually supposed to do, even kind of their norms and their ways of working. Okay, so big picture takeaway from this sort of key conclusion was that there is significant concern, interest in AI ethics in the transformative approach. I would say it's unprecedented. So if you look at biotechnology, nanotechnology, internet, you don't see this speed or coverage of ethics in these fields as much as in AI. So the fact that every single AI policy document, essentially every national AI policy strategy has a chapter on ethics is remarkable. But nevertheless, the actors in these documents, they sort of defaulted to their traditional understandings of innovation policy. What were the real problems? What was the real evidence that counts? It's these traditional indicators. What were the viable solutions? So arguably, there's been an unprecedented change in focus for AI policy, but not something like a paradigm shift yet. Okay, so that's the high picture takeaway, my interpretation from this evidence. But welcome thoughts. And then just to bring us to the present for our last slide. Okay, so where does this leave us a few years in the future? Have we seen essentially this story carry forward for the last few years, where we have a sort of a stable, we call policy image. We know what AI is, and it's about innovation, and we're going to balance benefits and risks, and we need people to trust AI, so we adopt it. Is this sort of the story that's shaping AI policy, or might there be an opening of new policy windows? And I'm thinking in this time period, obviously, a popularization of generative AI has changed public awareness. Misinformation is a highly prominent topic. Labor, auditing, AI safety has gotten a new energy. It goes back to the 2000s, but has not become popular until the last couple of years. So could there be new windows in this space that might change the conversation? And might there be new issues or resurrected issues that are especially salient to new segments of the public? Open versus closed sourced AI. Do we release the large language models to the public? Is this about long-term risks or short-term ethical goals? What do we do about big technology companies? Do they have too much power? So might there still be disruption or different directions this could go? And I welcome people's thoughts on where they see AI policy going, where they see the agenda going in South Korea, where they think it should go. I'm just pulling up a list of some recent work that I've been doing here. So this study is the fifth one down, looking through a policy window with tinted glasses, but more recently have been looking at things like, again, framing contestation, whether the public actually influences policymakers, bringing out some quantitative evidence. A paper that Kaylin's going to present later today on citizen perceptions of AI in government. And with that, I look forward to the discussant comments and conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for your informative and insightful presentation on the U.S. policy on AI. Thank you. I give the mic to Professor Wookjoon.
Hello, my name is Wookjoon Song. I'm working in the Seoul National University of Science Technology. My major is public administration, and my special interest is the information policy and policy evaluation and data analysis. It is a little nervous. There are so many people, and welcome. Yeah. I have heard Daniel Schiff and he and her, him and her, from my colleagues in the U.S. And I have led many papers about the AI and the AI policies in the U.S. Yeah. It's nice to meet you. First, thank you for your excellent presentations. I have three comments and 2 questions. First comment, it is very interesting and impressive. This paper is very impressive to manage the topics of AI policies. Generally, the documents of government policy is very important to PA researchers, but we use them limitedly to introduce history or timelines of policy government. But Dr. Schiff ties together through the MSF theories. It is a good, excellent attempts, and it works. Second, the Schiff added the depths of MSF to use the competing model. Traditional technology innovation and first the transformative approach. Most researchers, including me, have used MSF to explain irrational the policy-making process due to ambiguity and time restraint and so on. And this research is focused on 3 streams: the problem, politics, and the policies, especially policy entrepreneur. In other words, who is the policy entrepreneur? Which stream is more important in that policy and cases? However, she focused to explain the results of US AI policy to use the competing model. It is very interesting, and it is a big help to me. Thank you. Third, the result of research is very interesting. Although the attempts, the transformative approach have expanded their influences compared to the other times. However, they have ended up being limited. This shows our future challenges and policy taskers and so on. Yeah. I have 2 questions. The first is the MSF models. Is MSF appropriated model to explain that case? As you know, the MSF is basically to explain the irrational policy process due to the ambiguity and time restraints and so on. When I read and listen to papers, your presentations, it looks rational process about the AI policy to me. So it is the first questions. Second is the similes, the things, the small things. MS aims to explain the process of policies, as you know, but this research is pay attention to explain the differences of the result of 2 different models. It is the stimulus. You can focus the process or the result, but In my opinions, the MSF is focused on the process of policy process. So which is your focus? Second question is as you know, important thing to policy process theory is not only who decided, but also who is what is decided, and for whom is decided is very important. So we analyze the contents of the result of policy. So according to this research, you emphasize extended of the participations. My question is, it is related. It seems that the important. The problem is not the problem is not the problem is extendedness of participations, but the involvement of the companies, AI bank companies. As you know, that iron triangle is a very important issues that the policy process. So it seems that the important task is to shift to a transformative approach is the participation of citizens, not companies. So I wonder this participation. I wonder your focus. Where is your focus? It is my second question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sung. He's ready? Not yet? Oh, okay. You answered.
Well, thank you so much for those comments and observations. Glad this resonated with you as a policy scholar here. So let's see. Starting with your first question and your first comment, I think you make interesting observations about the nature of the multiple streams framework, and in fact, some of the inherent challenges with policy scholarship, policy process scholarship. So the multiple streams framework is notoriously broad. It had all of these different public and parties and interests and actors and problems, and they're all getting matched and everyone's fighting. So it's this broad conceptual framework. Most often when it's referenced, sort of one of two ways. One is just a very a thinner superficial mention, which is not necessarily bad, but maybe someone says problem definition or policy. I'm just going to take one concept here, and it's going to help me with whatever my study is. The second common approach that you referenced is really this process tracing and case study work, where you look at these relational processes. I say, how did internet governance form in this time period? How did this organic food law pass? And I'll examine these documents and sort of do it holistically. And you're quite right that what I did here is a little bit unusual. And I was very much in this space of, well, we want to do something concrete and tangible and have explanatory power. To what extent can we quantify some of this? How can we provide different forms of evidence, both qualitative and quantitative? So I'm glad that broadly speaking, it sort of resonated as something that seems viable. I had seen some strategies that attempt to operationalize it in various quantitative models. They often have to pick just a few dimensions here, or they do something like assign a very simple score. Is there a advocacy group, plus 1 point? So the distance between the rich conceptual world and the way to operationalize this empirically is a very profound challenge for policy scholars, and I'm glad that you sort of found this one as doing it in a meaningful way. But I also always want to be very sensitive to the limitations of this kind of work, because there's so many more types of evidence that we would want to do the process tracing and the interviews. And one of the projects, let me preview one of the projects that I've been working on recently. Indices. Okay, so taking this into the present, in the last couple of, last year or two, I've been working with Georgetown on a new project we're calling the AI Governance and Regulatory Archive, or Agora. So a forum for public debate in Greece. So what this is doing is looking at legislation, regulation standards in the future, and coding them in detail. We've started with US federal legislation here, and we have so far coded all adopted legislation, and are now adding in state level or sort of subnational legislation, other governments' legislation. So we'd be looking at things like basic information about the laws, what are the risks that are mentioned, what are the harms, what are the governance strategies, essentially the policy solutions, are there incentives for compliance or enforcement? And our coder team will go along and they'll look through all of these policy instruments and they'll code this in detail. And this is giving us, this is our process. We have annotators and validators. So there's a reliability process of making this database. And we end up with something like this, where you can open up a policy document, an instrument, and you can say, who authorized this, what are the risks, what are the harms, you can filter, tag, things like that. So this gets us a little bit closer to a standard tabular data set where we can run regressions and those kinds of things. So this is, I would say, another step in trying to operationalize from these broad issues down to things that we can attempt. So we're excited about this project. We just submitted the first paper on that. So those are some thoughts about MSF. So I'd say broadly, I'm eager to explore new ways to use these theories and to operationalize them with new methods, knowing that we have papers that keep coming out that's saying the MSF has these weaknesses and limitations, and how do we operationalize, how do we do hypothesis testing? So I'm eager to push those boundaries, and I'm happy to make mistakes along the way also, including things like looking at the results as well as the process. Can we use this to inform that? Second question is also a really great, important question, which is, is the interest here, is the focus on, is it about eliciting meaningful public participation? And you suggest something which is, or is it about disrupting the iron triangle? One way that we've heard the public sector, private sector, civil society organizations all say, we want public participation, we want diverse participation, we want philosophers and historians and ethicists and all this stuff shaping AI. So there's all these calls for diverse participation, but the evidence here suggests that there isn't a ton of it being done well, certainly in our context. I think other countries may have more well-developed modalities here. And I think this raises the question of what does it mean to make participation meaningful here? So you have venues like public opinion. Does public opinion meaningfully shape policymaker decisions? Does the public have well-formulated opinions that can answer these questions? Or what level of engagement or information do they need to do so? You have, on the other hand, civil society who will articulate that they're the voice of the public. So in the midst of the new bipartisan AI task force, a roadmap that was put out a couple weeks ago, 10 or 20 civil society groups put out a shadow task force report meant to be a criticism of the federal legislation. And they said, look, I think it was called Putting the Public in the Driver's Seat. And this is like 2 weeks ago. So they said, we civil society, we're the voice of the public, we reflect their interests, and that's why we need to be in the driver's seat, not just a participant. But this gets even messier because there are reasons to think that civil society doesn't always reflect the public voice and public opinion. They may reflect a progressive element or a more elite element. So I would say, broadly, there are many dimensions of advancing public engagement and meaningful shaping of policy that I'm thinking about in my research. It's usually a common theme. I find that there are a lot of gaps between the general ambition and how rigorously and seriously we're actually thinking about developing processes to educate, inform, and bring in the public. So any dimension of that is worth pursuing, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that as well. But thank you very much for your comments and questions.
Okay, we have some technical problems for the Professor Patrick Stur's access to our system. So I give this some chance for the comments and the question for Daniel. First of all, I give the chance to speak for the foreign scholars first. Okay, so anyone? Yeah, Professor Adam Parker from University of Seoul.
Thank you. Yes, so I had one kind of methodological question and then kind of a thought about kind of the whys of what you're seeing. So the methodological question is simply, and of this set of documents, what do you see them as being representative of? Is this a set of documents representative of kind of federal policymaking broadly, kind of how these documents were selected, and what you see them as being a case of? And the second thing is trying to think about kind of the whys of why is there a lack of this kind of transformative approach that we see. And I think there's kind of two things that pop to mind to me. One, kind of drawing on my own research, is kind of a lack of, as you were alluding to in your answers to the previous comments, kind of a lack of organizing structures in many ways for the public and for workers in particular. So my work is on unions, as we'll talk about later today. And while I didn't look at it with this particular thing in mind, I see much of the transformative approach reflected in what I see of unions doing with respect to automation, 70 years ago. And it seems that unions were a large driver of those kinds of human social impact, thinking about those concerns. And so maybe a relative weakness of unions in many countries speaks to part of why we don't see as much of a transformative approach. But I was also thinking in terms of the problem stream that you identified, a lot of these social impacts that this transformative approach might be more interested in are still fairly notional. They kind of, we know that they might happen or that they can be happening in certain places, but the early impacts tend to be on more marginalized communities who don't have the strongest voice. And so I'm wondering if perhaps this is just a reflection of a lack of salience for many people in these kinds of impacts, where it still feels more like fear mongering from the future rather than like a thing that's actually here today now that needs to be addressed. So, thank you.
Both great questions and thoughts, Adam. Thanks so much for this. So in reverse order. So I totally agree that a lack of organizing structure is a great way to articulate one of the major problems here. So, one, this could be, unions, lack of collectives that are advocating for these things. Hence, we have old and new civil society groups popping up that are trying to speak for these groups. We don't have, well-established processes for citizen participation in U.S. governance, broadly speaking. So we have requirements in public administration to open up proposed regulations for public comment. So there'll be a website and there will be a notice, and as all the public administration scholars know, you can go there and you can submit your comments and say, oh, well, I want to make this change. If you look at the participants of these requests for comment, requests for information, all of these Office of Management and Budget, the NIST, all these agencies that have put out calls, they're 95% industry, lobby groups, civil society groups, occasionally a professor. This is not a venue where members of the public have deliberate channels to get their voice. And we essentially don't have them. We have efforts from even groups like OpenAI to fund democratic AI governance strategies and people doing creative research projects where we'll do citizen assemblies, but none of this is institutionalized or formalized. So how do we expect that some executive agency is just gonna create a new citizen task force that can help shape regulations? We don't do this. Even with public budgeting, even when we have done this more, there's still been concerns that it hasn't been done well enough. There's accusations of participation washing. So I would think, that we would need to build in formal organizing structures and institutions in addition to exploring best practices. We can do lots of little research and learn from design thinking and other lines of research that have thought of ways to bring in diverse voices, but we need the structures if we're going to actually implement this. To your methodological question, what do these documents represent, or what do they not represent? So they're the federal level, so they're representing U.S. federal AI policy. I think in some ways it is capturing broader AI policy discourse. That's certainly not a claim that I've wanted to make in the paper, but I think it does. You see some convergence with even EU AI policy, with global AI policy. Strengths and weaknesses of these documents. So obviously we're losing out on presidential stump speeches. We're losing out on congressional messages. So you could look at politician emails to their constituents. You could look at politician social media messages. This paper, the one that I published most recently on this, is doing that, is looking at tweets from policymakers and whether messaging from the public influences them using time series models and stuff like that. So I think different types of sources to look at here. But a benefit of these agencies is that they're arguably more neutral. So a lot of them are putting out reports. They're not putting out these extremely loaded things where they're trying to impress their constituents and credit claim or things like that. They're saying, here's a report, here are the benefits of AI, here are the challenges. So I think this gets something close as we can get to a sort of a neutral sense of what they think the problems and solutions, what they think the agenda should be. So I did find it to be, I think, especially useful and maybe somewhat under-examined in policy spaces where we like to look at Congress and things like that. Yeah. But again, thanks, really great questions.
Any other comments and questions? Yeah, Professor Yang.
Yes, thank you very much also for your presentation. I just have a very basic question. How do these documents define AI? Because you mentioned AI is emerging and is new. I agree, but how do they define AI? Because this is essential. If a technology is not defined as AI, it's not covered by any of these guidelines or potential legislation. So how is AI defined in these notions exactly?
A good question, very foundational question. Yeah, and as you know, this is a source of constant political debate itself, right? How advanced are the techniques have to be considered AI? Should we just have technology neutral definitions and things like that? Many of these documents treat it as a holistic policy subsystem. So you might wonder, and some people might think, well, really that there isn't such a thing. Maybe there's autonomous vehicles, and that's very different from automated decision systems in welfare and robotic surgery. Why are we talking about this in the same breath? But indeed, many of the documents do treat AI and AI policy as a field that sort of collects many of these things. Your typical document will give something referencing a set of statistical techniques, a set of computer domains, vision, natural language understanding, optimization, search, things like that. Many of them will reference the OECD AI definition, which is the version of that is in the European Union AI Act. So they're broadly in that space. There's a good study from a couple of years ago that sort of systematically looked at policy definitions compared to academic definitions and whether they're about abstract reasoning skills or about replacing humans and things like that. They tend to differ a little bit from academic or technical approaches to AI, but they are this more holistic, this technology that makes decisions, it's autonomous, it has learning features, things like that. Yeah, so that's kind of the story of what AI has become defined as.
Any other comments and questions? Oh, yeah, Kate.
Thanks, Daniel, for this presentation. I have a set of questions related to this idea of a transformative approach to AI. So my first question is, how did you determine what counts as a transformative approach? Next, so you really helpfully walk through the MSF approach and describe how importantly in the MSF approach, policy entrepreneurs work to couple problems and solutions. In your results, you sort of tackle problems and solutions independently. So I wondered if you could comment on the coupling of traditional or transformative problems and solutions. We see a matching where traditional problem definitions are coupled with traditional policy solutions. Relatedly, and moving on from that, does your finding about mostly traditional framings and approaches persist, or is this perhaps just reflective of the early period of AI development, where people in government were latching on to traditional approaches because they were working with what they had? And then lastly, and hopefully providing room for further discussion, where do transformative ideas come from? And if they are lacking thus far, how can we get them into government?
Wonderful questions. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Okay, so starting with the more straightforward, where did the transformative ideas come from? How did I decide what was transformative or not? So first, admittedly, it was a pretty, I want to say, crass heuristic for thinking about an issue. So traditional stuff, transformative stuff, one is sort of more ethicsy, one's more sort of innovation-y. I did think the simplified approach was helpful for making this topic accessible and salient and capturing sort of overarching streams of discourse. But it is a simplification of a much more messy reality. And as I ran into, and I got to these sort of hybrid categories and things like that. But I would be looking at things like major AI ethics papers, reports put out by civil society, meta-analyses that have looked at the most popular topics. So anyone in the AI ethics space, we know bias, transparency, explainability, privacy. These are prominent AI ethics topics that the organizations will put out in their newsletters. So some were coming from there. Others were coming from the literature on responsible research and innovation, on mission-oriented innovation, on modern governance. So the move from more traditional expert-led to these renewed claims, and that go back centuries, but renewed claims for public involvement and things like that. So I would say from those discourses broadly, I was gathering the categories and saying, oh yeah, this is more traditional, this is supply side, and these are more transformative. Sometimes it's not totally clear, and sometimes there's overlap there, but that's the origin of that. Coupling problems with solutions, I wish I had the graph up there. I would say the coupling of problems and solutions was not done very well, was not done very robustly. So the way I coded this was, again, a crass in this effort to operationalize. I coded at the paragraph level. I looked, so I would, a paragraph at a time, did they mention the problem and solution, or a problem and a stakeholder in the same paragraph, in the same breath? Now, this is not how most documents were structured. Most documents were structured with mission statement, a list of problems, and then 20 pages later, a list of solutions. So there's actually no formal connection in the overwhelming majority of cases between problems and solutions. Then you're sort of left to infer, hey, you mentioned all of these concerns, but then you jumped to research and development, data quality, data access, more computer science PhDs. So I would say many of the topics that you would expect would need deliberate strategies. You say, oh, there's a lack of diversity in the AI workforce. Whatever it is, you don't see a particular solution that messages that. Otherwise, analytically, I've struggled to find more robust ways to make that matching, but it's essentially not part of the structure of the documents. So more creative ideas about how to do that, or with different data to do that, would be wonderful. But it is a problem, right? If our streams don't really come together, we just, here's some problems, here's some solutions, let's stick it out there. Okay, next you ask a big and important question. Does this framing or overarching conclusion, has this persisted in the last 3 or 4 years? So this is a tough one. And I want to say yes, I think it has. I'm thinking of the bipartisan regulatory framework that came out 2 weeks ago that funds innovation and talks about ethics but has no regulation built in, leading to a civil society shadow report. This is quite a profound contest even recently. We saw debates about Congress, please fund the AI Safety Institute. We have these important documents that have come out, like the White House AI Bill of Rights. It's just a voluntary, it's a great document. It's brilliantly done. The leadership in that document was wonderful, but it's not an enforced bill. It's not in law. It's just a really nice document. And if you talk to industry, are you using the AI Bill of Rights to set your policies? No, people aren't aware of it. They don't read it. Same thing with the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, probably our most important regulatory document. It's a voluntary framework. Companies can pick it up and they can sort of, oh, let's align our company practices to this, but it's totally optional. And if you chat with NIST, as we do it as part of, as a member of the AI Safety Consortium, they'll say, we're not a regulator. We want to give good guidance and hopefully this is helpful, but we're not a regulator, so we can't be accountable for that. So I would say it seems to persist that the innovation strategies, the funding, that continues to make its way through, and the ethics and safety work, the transformative ideas, they continue to be talked about, and there's great research, and there's maybe some areas where there becomes a social consensus and we make changes. So we say, we don't want deepfakes used in elections. We don't want deepfakes used in child sexual abuse material. We're going to pass laws. So we do make some changes, but I don't see anything like a big shift If anything, I would say the commentary would be of a shift more towards industry power. I mean, more criticism of that. So we have OpenAI fighting about whether it was concerned enough about safety. We have members of the board resigning. We have the AI safety leadership of the organization resigning, and a new board internally, not an external, but a self-regulatory board led by the CEO. So probably even more concern about industry power. So even more traditional, less transformative, if anything. And then your last question was, where did transformative ideas come from? Can you remind me?
Yeah, the idea is, if the transformative approach is lacking in government right now, as per your findings, where do these ideas or where do these trainings or solutions come from, and how do we get them better represented in the agenda?
I think to a large degree, we have a coordination and knowledge synthesis problem. So we now have many institutions and researchers and civil society groups, many standards. IEEE has 17 AI ethics standards of its own. Probably none of us can name more than 2 or 3 of them. If you're a company and you say, oh, which of these 30 standards should I adopt? Well, I'm going to adopt the one that the government says is the main one. What do I do with all this other stuff out here? So we have all of these different solutions floating around, but we haven't been able to pull our ideas together and say, this is the best practice, this is the consensus, this is what the standards organizations are supposed to do in a lot of ways. But this has been tricky because the governments will say, oh, you need to be fair and ethical, and the standards group, you guys tell us how to do fairness. And the standards groups, if you go and you sit on their committees, they'll sort of say, hey guys, how do we make technology ethical? And it's a challenge. How do you operationalize in technical detail social, justice and political philosophy and all these complex concepts? So I think we've kicked the can down the road in some ways. We have lots of cool ideas, but we haven't synthesized them. We need more systematic ways to pull together our best ideas and to pilot them in applied settings and get really good evidence and feedback. And this will help us deal with, bloat and overproliferation of ideas. So I think they're out there. I think there are many cool things we can do that we can get across the, the finishing line that will be broadly supported. And then I think there are other things that are obviously just very politically contentious. So take something like a universal basic income. It had a little bit of attention in US policy when Andrew Yang was running, dropped off the radar completely. There was an op-ed in Brookings a few weeks ago on a robot tax. That's been floated for different years, but it's not in the mainstream policy agenda. So a more radical idea, changing the social safety net, changing worker power, that would need probably organizing structures, coordinated action, and say, everyone all believes in a universal basic income, or we all believe in worker rights. That for the more transformative stuff, and better coordination for the more technical stuff. It would be a couple ideas.
I'm sorry, we can't solve the technical problem. So Professor Stewart can't present his discussion, but he already sent material for discussion. So Dr. Jie Jung, our center's researcher, summarized Professor Stewart's comment and the question instead of on behalf of Professor Stewart. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for the wonderful presentation. I just got the email saying that he's having difficulties still, so maybe he'll be able to join while I talk. And also, this is not the original discussion that I had with Daniel, so I might not be able to cover everything, but I'll try to cover the things that I've overheard from both of them. So basically, these slides are made into 2 different sections, I believe. So first one is about the what he likes about this presentation, and the second part more commenting on the how to improve those the work of the Daniel. So as we already mentioned multiple streams framework applied to AI policy itself looks very much interesting. And I believe even though Kaylin mentioned as well, it has lots of meanings itself, but also some questions along with it. Also, the way Daniel presented the competing predictions for AI policy based on the elements of the MSF itself is like very much intuitive. So to say, like some key indicators and focusing events are divided into two different sections of like traditional paradigm as well as transformative paradigm, and he tried to put into the details about what he covers, so that readers would understand what he's actually doing with the sectors, each section's details. So that was very much explanatory. Furthermore, the coding itself was very self-explanatory, and most very much interesting thing to me as well was the fact that he tried to look into very specific values, specified into either traditional or transformative or even hybrid way. So looking into specific coding, how he did it in in different kind of sections is very meaningful in a way that he tried to compare those two different kinds of dynamics. Oh my God, finally.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I share?
Yeah.
And I could just go ahead and start because I have written this up, spent some time thinking about this, and I really appreciate the time to be able to respond to this paper. And I want to thank, first of all, Seoul National University Center for Intelligence Society and Policy for this distinct honor. And it is a unique opportunity to take part as a discussant on a paper by Daniel Schiff that came out just rather recently under review of policy research, looking through a policy window with tinted glasses, setting the agenda for U.S. AI policy. Now, not having seen the presentations, sadly, I was out of town and coming back into town. One thing that I can say, and it's already been stated before probably, is that most conferences, workshops, and academic events such as these focus on the development of manuscripts and not necessarily the impact on how we view the world. And by revisiting this paper, we can see how well it fares in helping us understand the opportunity and challenges in this era of artificial intelligence. Now, having read, cited, and been influenced by this article over the course of my AI biometric research, it was an easy ask for me to take part in this. Although organizing this across the international date line has become a little bit more difficult, obviously. But over the past 2 weeks, this research has become even more salient. On May 15th, the bipartisan Senate AI Working Group released their long-awaited report. On May 20th, a shadow report was released by multiple interest groups in response to the U.S. Senate Working Group and the perceived failures by them to reflect the public will. Almost concomitantly, on May 13th, OpenAI launched its voice assistant, Sky, whose voice was a near replica of Scarlett Johansson's AI personal assistant and girlfriend, Samantha, in the 2014 Spike Jonze movie, Her. On May 20th, Scarlett Johansson went public with her concerns, stating that she was shocked, angered, and in disbelief that the voice was eerily similar to hers. In short, a lot has happened over the course of the past couple of weeks. Processing all of this AI information certainly would benefit from a mental model, which is what Dr. Schiff's article provides here. So going to the next slide, please. Now, if there are any defining factors regarding artificial intelligence and the policies meant to address it, it is that this arena is highly uncertain, with much unknown about what exactly AI is and how it works. This is largely due to the opaque algorithms that underlie many of the systems. As a result, there is a great deal of ambiguity regarding how to approach AI as there are many different ways of thinking about the same technology and the effect it can potentially have on everyday life. The multiple streams framework is uniquely positioned to help address this ambiguity and uncertainty, especially with those technologies in their nascent stages of policy development. Over a quarter of a century ago, I found the multiple streams framework to be a useful framework myself as I wrote my dissertation on agricultural biotechnology policy. As the new products in the form of flavor-saver tomatoes, as well as pesticide and herbicide-resistant cotton, corn, and soybean made their way from a laboratory to the fields to the store shelf, there was a similar level of concern by the general public as there now is with AI. Now, Dr. Schiff's analysis of AI policy by systematically coding U.S. federal documents from 2016 to 2020 underscores the importance of using this framework to come to grips with the uncertain and ambiguous new technologies from the very inception of government involvement. So it's done incredible work here. Now, as Dr. Schiff states, AI policy is arguably best understood to be undergoing agenda setting, the often contentious process wherein policy actors compete to shape the key policy problems and solutions that will set the stage for future policy making. By using the MSF, the multiple streams framework, Dr. Schiff organizes what could be seen as chaotic into understandable mental framework that can be used in an iterative manner, in which I will be looking at with these recent events. Next slide, please. Now, one of the key goals in the framing of policy problems from which one can infer policy solutions that should be implemented is defining a technology. On the one hand, a technology can be defined as merely incremental and natural outgrowth of previous technologies, albeit one that is innovative enough that it requires economic investment, education, and a more relaxed, if not laissez-faire attitude towards regulation to ensure the full potential of the novel technology being reached. Support is called for, often in the face of international competition, which forms an external and exogenous pressure to make sure that the funding is available. This, most obviously, is the traditional paradigm. I've seen this with biotechnology policy in its early days, whether it was biomedical or agriculturally oriented biotechnology. On the other hand, the transformative paradigm, which was and is rarely seen in official documents, focuses on the catastrophic and uncontrollable risks unleashed by the new technology, with the burden of these risks more likely to be the poor masses dealing, the society's weak and vulnerable being affected. Whether it was Frankenfoods poisoning those of the poor masses who are unknowingly consuming genetically engineered corn chips, or artificial intelligence potentially stealing middle-class jobs, the unknown threatens society as we know it. As a result, the precautionary principle in which risks are seen to be necessarily more thoroughly identified and prepared for should be used. Next slide, please. Because one of the key measures of the usefulness of frameworks and the articles that convey them is the use of the framework to understand the policy world. Dr. Schiff's article does just that, as it is eerily easily applied to the recent AI policy events that I just mentioned, here in the United States specifically. When looking at the official U.S. Senate Working Group document, Driving U.S. Innovation in Artificial Intelligence, what we see there on your left, we see a more accentuated traditional paradigm than has been the case with the more circumspect documents from the executive branch, which has been pointed out by Dr. Schiff as being more neutral in its approach than the legislature. The response by the multiple nonprofits and the academics 5 days later put the public in the driver's seats. The Shadow Report provides an interesting counterpoint by emphasizing what may be seen as the transformative paradigm. Next slide, please. So, with the Senate Artificial Intelligence Working Group, we can see that the traditional paradigm was reflected in both the forum topic choices, what you see there on the left, that initially framed the issues and the problems that were to be addressed, and ultimately the solutions that were preferred. To quote John Kingdom from his book that started it all, 1984, as he introduced the multiple streams framework, advocacy of solutions often precedes the highlighting of problems to which they are attached. In other words, solutions chase problems. This can be further seen in the tenor of the language used. There is emphasis and urgency given to supporting U.S. innovation in AI and national security, what you see on the right there. The idea that $32 billion per year should be spent on non-defense AI innovation, and that the AI working group, that the national security there should be collaboration on this. On the other hand, there's a degree of hesitancy regarding artificial intelligence and the workforce, as the language used, what you see in the middle there, appears to assuage and reassure rather than setting up systematic regulatory plans. And we can see that with the terms there. This is, I would almost say it's a mealy-mouthed language. The AI working group recognizes the apprehension surrounding the inherent uncertainties of this technology and encourages a conscientious consideration of the impact AI will have on the workforce. This is certainly not systematically approaching anything. Thus, this traditional paradigm is not unexpected, especially if we look at those 31 participants that took part in that inaugural forum in September 2023. We had such individuals as Microsoft's Bill Gates, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, Tesla and the social media platform formerly known as Twitter's Elon Musk, OpenAI's Sam Altman, Google's Sundar Pichai, and NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, amongst others. And even when you did have nonprofit groups, a couple of them were originally started and funded by Google. So certainly there was a lot of internal politicking and framing of the issue already. Next slide, please. So when we start looking at, let's hold it. Anyhow. So when we look at the transformative paradigm, we see much more of a focus on the policy problems, solutions in a manner that is more easily understood by the general public. For instance, on the left-hand side, you see such things as racial justice and equity, immigration, AI accountability. These are all things that Dr. Schiff noted in his report that the focus should emphasize societal and ethical objectives, such as reducing inequality and serving vulnerable groups. So it's a movement towards more of the general public. And we can see that in the languages used with racial justice, with AI and immigration, and with labor. These are all things that look at not replicating and exacerbating societal inequalities with racial justice. With AI and immigration, there are serious concerns about funding of organizations that use this technology for forms of social control that do not provide much in the way of oversight. And of course, labor concerns do certainly come about as a result. Okay, next slide, please. So when we consider focusing events and the key indicators, one of the things that we consider is that the multiple streams framework, looking more broadly at how it's structured, relies upon the political policy and problem streams coupling for agenda change to occur. And it appears that the traditional paradigm that players have largely used constrains the scope of conflict. In other words, it's a way of keeping the conflict within the policy realm itself, where there is not much in the way of outsiders having involvement, and it's more technically oriented. So the agenda change, that when it does occur, it is under control of those major players that we saw within the Senate bipartisan Senate report. Next slide, please. Now, I was going to make sure that we had a nice slide here, but this is interesting in the sense that arguably recently Scarlett Johansson having her voice, her voice, as you will, or a simulacron thereof being used by OpenAI without her consent might prove to be an event, a focusing event that expands the scope of conflict to the general public, especially away from this relatively insulated issue area that's very complex. Because now we move into issues that are more easily accessible to the general public, such as that of identity and power. So in Dr. Schiff's terms, they're more salient, accessible, and related to public concerns, and they're less expert-oriented. Now, the interesting thing here is that we have seen this happen already. Currently undergoing legislation with breaking apart of a trust with the selling of tickets was Taylor Swift brought a lawsuit, and she used her legal power to engage with that. And recently, deepfakes regarding her have brought up this issue as well. So this is something that has come up in the news and has come up again with Scarlett Johansson as far as what exactly is identity? What exactly is the level of control someone has over their identity? And if we can go to the next slide, there are legal and bioethical issues that might be considered with, at least in the United States, with the OpenAI's use of Sky and the potential that this is a deepfake. First of all, there's copyright law. Copyright law might be understood as being a factor here as a result of the fact that it was a performance by Scarlett Johansson in the movie Her, and its behavior, and its creative behavior. On the other hand, we're looking at potential for consent and privacy to be implicated here in the sense of the identity of Scarlett Johansson. And this is certainly, if we look at cases that have come before, and this is why we might consider bioethics as a framework that does help out, is that there has been concern over the usage of people's genetic materials to create and use, create cell lines, the HeLa cell line for Henrietta Lacks, and I believe it was the Mo cell line from John Moore and the Board of Regents, in his case against the Board of Regents, to deal with hairy cell leukemia diagnosis. So what we're looking at here is legal issues, but these are also something that are very accessible to the general public, especially when we're considering such things as the biometrics that are connected with us. So could we move to the next slide, please? So the question is, first of all, can we see the cases of Scarlett Johansson and the deepfakes of major stars, as well as the current events dealing with copyright, as being focusing events that are drawing attention to the public? Should they be seen as feedback as far as what has happened, or are they just indicators of where things might be moving? These are certainly questions to be addressed with. If we can go to the next slide, please. So from here, I have general questions for the author. And again, I apologize for not being able to join you earlier. And certainly I brought these questions out earlier so that Dr. Schiff knows that I'm going to be asking them. At least I hope he does. First questions are more policy framework choice questions. There are multiple different frameworks out there, at least 6 to 7 of them. Why did you choose the multiple streams framework as your analytic lens? And what are those other policy frameworks that you think would provide useful insights? And how do you think that they would provide those insights? Within the multiple streams framework, there are questions that I do have. First of all, criticisms of the multiple streams framework suggest it's best used as a heuristic, as it does not necessarily allow for hypothesis testing. As the article is mainly descriptive, arguably out of necessity, would you agree with this or maybe disagree? Do you think that there are hypothesis testing that you can carry out if you revisit this project? And also connected with this is when John Kingdon wrote this, or the original framework, he saw it as mainly working in disorderly systems like the United States with its federalism and with its separation of powers. Do you think it could be transformed to more orderly systems such as South Korea? I have a few specific questions as well in the next slides I'd like to bring up, and then we'll go back and if we will, then I'll have questions for the audience to go and maybe consider, and then we can go back to the major questions. Anyhow, next slide, please. Okay, so when we look at the framework itself, Dr. Schiff, do you see that there are partisan differences regarding artificial intelligence in the United States, or do you think that AI policy might be the one thing that Americans can agree upon? Next slide, please. When we look at the problem streams, do you think there has been enough time since you collected data on this article for the US AI policy to have a feedback cycle? I think one of the defining elements of artificial intelligence is how quickly it's moving and how quickly it has been pushed. With these rather quick movements forward, do we have this rather swift feedback cycle? What would the feedback look like, and what do you think it would be telling us, and would you suggest different feedback metrics that might be useful? And could we go to the next slide, please? Oh yes, there we go. Okay, lastly, can you see a policy community be as emerging with US AI policy in general? Now, we've seen certainly a traditional and transformative, but are the outlines and the players fairly well defined now? We can say, yes, those are major players, and those are not as involved. In other words, has there been systematic coalition building that has occurred? Okay, could we go to the next slide? And this is the last slide here, and this is just for the audience generally. I like to consider biomedical ethics and bioethical questions as far as this, and certainly AI ethics does rely an awful lot upon the principles of biomedical ethics to draw out the questions that they do have. But these are a little bit more simple questions, a little bit more fundamental, and something I'd like the audience to consider before we let Dr. Schiff respond, if he will, is first of all, what makes someone unique? That's the first question. Is it their physiology that gives an individual their identity? For instance, is it their DNA, their fingerprints, facial recognition, voice recognition, their dental work, what have you? Or is it the actions an individual engages in on a regular basis? Second generation biometrics uses such things as an individual's gait, their posture, their body movement, their facial behavior, and their vocalics to identify people. And then having said this, what are the boundary conditions where we move from a person's identity to mimicry to something else completely? In other words, how much change can there be before a person is no longer genuine? And so those are the questions I'd like to leave the audience with. And if we can go back to the previous major slides for the author, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm a moderator. I'm Dongwook
Thank
Kim, professor of Graduate School of Public Administration, Seoul National University. Thank you for your comments and questions. Okay, brief response.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Patrick. Really, well thought out and deliberate comments. Appreciate you bringing us both into the present, reflecting on the theoretical applicability, and bringing in some analogies from your own work and for some salient issues today. So I'll try to answer each of your questions more briefly than they deserve, in the hopes of making some time for more comments from the audience or questions from our students. So, and you anticipated a couple of the questions that came on before you joined. So let's start with the policy framework questions. Why choose the MSF amongst other frameworks? And are there other frameworks that would provide useful insights? So the core reason for choosing this was very early days where I felt that we were, as you noted, in the agenda setting stage, without even an understanding of what AI was as an object of policy study. So I thought this was helpful to articulate that. And I do feel, and I think you've persuaded me even more, that there's value to having this large scale conceptual heuristic applied here. I did see problems and solutions emerging in this kind of way and attempts to couple them. Other policy frameworks that are useful, so I've also looked at the narrative policy framework. So I've applied that to the actions of policy entrepreneurs to influence the agenda. So the role of narratives and frames has seemed quite important to me in this space. I often like the quantification of ideas, so that interplay between the subjective and objective, or interpretive and positive. Other frameworks that I'm exploring now include the advocacy coalition framework and the policy conflict framework. I have a talented doctoral student who's looking at the formation of policy coalitions. So to one of your questions, a little bit later, I think we're starting to see the coalitions form. We know there's big tech. We know there's different subsystem actors in play, depending on whether you're in education or healthcare. We're getting an inkling for this. We know civil society. We have this great opposition between those dueling reports that you highlighted for us. But we haven't studied this systematically. So I think it's perfectly ripe for surveying, mapping the opinions, positions of these coalitions, and we are engaged in that with one of my students now. So hopefully we'll get some valuable insight from trying to play with these other theories. Related to MSF questions you asked, right, is this best as a heuristic? Should you engage in hypothesis testing? On the one hand, there's quite a space between such a framework and hypothesis testing. On the other hand, there's a persistent internal challenge within the policy community that we want to do more hypothesis testing and operationalization. So I enjoy exploring, pushing those boundaries, seeing how far we can take the frameworks, if we can take this to more testable theory. So I would say, the paper is predominantly descriptive. I bring in the conceptual framework focus on the traditional and transformative to bring in some explanatory thinking. I feel, fairly comfortable with how it worked, but I don't think, we're in a position where we can or maybe fully want to resolve the gap between framework and, modeling. I think that there is importance for interplay here, but I think we should explore that space more because we know that these criticisms will persist and are valid in some ways. You asked whether the MSF could be transferred to other systems. I do think it can. I think we'd just be talking about different things, like a different notion of what are the interests or balance of interests. What would constitute a focusing event, when a policy window would open. And as is the case in a lot of comparative work, sometimes we find that some elements are a little bit lacking or need to be specified more broadly. But I do think that it should be transferable. If I were to revisit, what would I expand upon? Would I stick with the MSF? I think I'm still happy with the exploration and the challenges that associated with that. I was never totally happy with things like my ability to match problems and solutions. The document structure didn't quite allow for that, as well as the definition of the hybrid categories. That's a really tricky thing. At the same time, I don't know that I would be able to add more in this paper. Certainly, it's already a long paper with a lot of different dimensions. Maybe there should be I'd love to be able to look at the coupling and find some other methodological way to approach that, maybe with a different paper. So that would be something I wish I could do better or expand upon, though I don't know exactly how. I like to go back to the actors in more detail. I just did experts and the public. but that's actually a way, it would be very feasible to go back and say, what were the modes of public engagement? Was it one-sided? Was it two-sided? Was it comments or meetings? So that's something I'd like to go back and look at. And another thing would be over time change. So I'm sitting on a student's dissertation defense in a couple weeks in Barcelona, and he actually has sort of a version of this that's 7 years long or 8 years long instead of 5 years. And it's enough that he broke his dissertation into the early period and the later period. So he's actually looking at changes, and I hope it's okay if I spoil one of his wonderful findings. I think it's already published. He finds that the US and the EU were split between the more pro-innovation and more precautionary, but that they actually converge towards a center. They converge towards each other over time. So I think the over time dynamics would be very interesting. Great. Okay, flipping forward a few pages. So I think I spoke to, let's see. A little bit to the policy community. We have an inkling, but we haven't studied this formally, and understanding the coalition building will be great. I have a clustering technique called sub-coalition clustering analysis, which I think will be really hopefully promising to figure out where these communities emerge. Are there latent coalitions? Are they matching with policy decisions that are being made? So once we can actually map the coalitions, we can see the degree of agreement or disagreement, and very sort of subtle, interesting communities like the ethics and safety communities, where do they fit in? So I'm really excited about this work on the actors. Feedback, this was another interesting observation. Are these indicators, focusing events, or feedback? Indeed, it can feel a little bit murky. Are we getting sort of very preliminary feedback on, oh, we don't like your proposals here, or look, we haven't done enough yet? I would say sort of traditionally, we think feedback occurs after policy implementation, and we'd say, okay, there's a policy, and did it save enough jobs? Did it protect enough people from harms? But a lot of AI governance is happening in industry. It's, did OpenAI make enough changes in its latest model? So we are getting feedback from AI development decisions and industry governance, maybe not enough time for formal feedback from policy processes. And I would agree that we don't have enough well-defined metrics in the transformative space. How many people's jobs retained meaning, or they still enjoyed them as much? They're not in our, and we could define some of these metrics. And I think it would be great to do that. There's a new initiative out of NIST looking at kind of social and ethical field testing. So I would love us to have a formulated set of metrics to say what would feedback look like in these spaces beyond GDP, adoption, public trust. And we're actually building an AI survey and public attitudes hub that maybe could be used for that kind of purpose. And then very, very briefly, partisan differences regarding AI and US AI policy. You've done a great job of predicting my research agenda. So you have a paper that will hopefully be finished in the next 3 or 4 weeks on whether AI will remain bipartisan or whether polarization is emerging. And we lay out a framework for different dimensions along which problems, actors at the level of state level, so state legislator, based on a survey of state legislators and case studies in 3 states about whether we see partisanship emerging. So happy to share the results of that paper, but essentially we're starting to see it emerge as we move beyond some initial areas of soft consensus. And again, thanks, really, really wonderful comments, really appreciate it.
Any brief comments from audience? Now, the time for the first session of our symposium is run out. So thank you, everybody, especially presenters, discussants, and audience, everybody. Thank you. This is the end of the first session. Second session will resume at 2 p.m. at this conference room. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much.